on it. Peak reads. Thank you. Thank you. I've been reading Sailor James' Notes on Dialectics, and I got the accumulation of capital and the crises by what's his name? I got him from Ultra. Ultra, get me there. You're gonna really push me off the Leninist train. Okay, we'll see what happens. I'm open to it for sure. I'm open to it. I am open to it. I'm always open to it. If it improves my dialectics, I'm open for it for sure. Thank you. Yes. He gave me those 2 books to read, and then like Salted Cloak gave me a couple of Sailor James books to read too. Yeah. So as soon as and then he gave me dialects on cognition. I can't remember the person's name, so I'm going to read that too. You know, so I'm trying to understand dialectics. I think it's important to understand dialectics to be able to engage. But I'm going to get started with this reading. Let's find out what contradictions we can point out here. Thank you, by the way, for all those books. Yeah, we are readers. I think it's okay to read things outside just as long as you have the Marxist critique on it and the analysis on it, which I need to improve better. But reading helps to improve it better, for sure. Yeah. All right, chapter 10. Let's get this done. Chapter 10. Sailor James and the Black Radical Tradition. Black labor and the black middle classes in Trinidad. Here we go. In the warm Caribbean Sea, where colonies of African labor were compressed onto the Antilles, the tropic archipelago that serpentined its way from the open claw of the Yucatan and Floridian Peninsula of Central and Northern America to the northern crowns of Venezuela and Colombia in South America. The same black anti-logic extended, oh my gosh, here's my first visible thing. Great. Anyways. Let me see, the Yucatan Peninsula in the Central and North America to the northern crowns of Venezuela and Cuba. In South America, the same black anti-logic extended itself into the 20th century. In the earlier century, it had destroyed the plantation's economy upon which the momentum of African slavery rested. But the Africanization of the islands, their transformation from forced labor into peasant economies, where daily life was mediated by the cultural syncretism and the diaspora. Wait, why does it say diaspora had been incomplete? Political power had been transferred from the venal order of the I keep doing this. Plantatiocrats, to the uneased accommodation between the imperial bureaucracy at the metropoles and the highest strata among the entrenched white minorities. Even Haiti, to employ the language of Ramborio again, as witnessing the destruction of democracy by property in fear of poverty. In the British possession, racial arrogance assumed the posture of truistship over the islands. Black populations and determined its proper structure would be that of the system of crown colonies. The colonial office soon realized that the West Indies were quite unsuited for the self-government. How could assemblies so blatantly unrepresentative of the bulk of the population be granted responsibility? Asked the veteran civil servant, Sir Henry Taylor. As the islands were fast becoming financial liabilities, the old representative constitutions became a bar to government. The new free population could never be represented under existing conditions. Thus, the idea took root at the the Caribbeans should be persuaded to reconsider their constitutions and become crown colonies. By 1875, all the Caribbean colonies except Barbados, to which might be added the Bahamas and Bermuda, agreed to give up their old constitutions and become crown colonies. In 1868, the colonial secretary announced that the new legislative council would all have a basic feature, quote, the power of the crown in the legislature. If pressed to its extreme limits, would avail to overcome every resistance that could be made at it. In other words, the British government had stepped into the Caribbean to protect the population from the power of the former slave-owning class. The alternative was, as demonstrated by the Black Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, was to suffer the colonial oligarchies, advertent but constant encouragement of violent black militancy. This, we may surmise, was an unacceptable political risk to the architects and guardians of the empire, the indigenous, I don't know if it's people from India, Sepoy Army in 1857, and the subsequent occupation of India by British troops, and was as well a senior and chartered member in the European scramble for Africa and Asia. Neither the English people themselves nor the masses of imperial subjects could be expected to perpetual accede to the imperial myth of civilizing in the face of the overtly selfish and catastrophic preoccupations of white settler colonists. For black peasants and workers in the British and Caribbeans, however, the new imperialism that displaced the Caribbean oligarchy was by far the more formidable enemy. While government power in the British home isles rechoded. I'm gonna have to look up this word, everybody. I like to look up words. It's always fun. Be right back. Oh my gosh, it's ricocheted, everybody. I'm sorry. Ricocheted between the liberals and conservative parties, as it had after the reform bills of 1867 and 1884, while state policy staggered between free trade, free production, and freedom of nationalities. That is, home rule for the Irish and Welsh, the anti-imperialists, and the alternative of aggressive jingoistic imperialism. What is that word? He's going to use words that I don't know. Jingoistic. That's what it says. Jingoistic. I have no idea. I've never seen that word. Jingoistic. Do I have it? It describes a fantastical, hey, I got approved, aggressive form of patriotism that holds an extreme international belief in the country's superiority, often accompanied by a warlike foreign policy. Okay, so it's bad. Or it's not, I don't know. I don't know how to get past morals. I'm trying. Imperialism, popular support for the global British presence, was measurably consistent. Even a select committee of the House of Commons, as early as 1865, had, quote, recommended that most British colonies should be given up as soon as possible and that they should be prepared for independence. And industrialized Britain was then more than a match for its European rivals, and its domestic economy reflected its international domination of commerce. But in the last decades of the 19th century, quote, Britain was a new herself to be threatened by, quote, empires. Sandwiched between the diplomatic and mercantile momenta of Germany, France, Russia, and the United States, overdrawn by financial scandal and mismanagement. The weakening British economy and its restive public encouraged and compelled the imperialist faction that until then could only pursue its vision with restraint. Even the final liberal government of the 19th century, 1892 to 95, was overwhelmed by the imperialist ethos. By the fateful conservative victory in 1895, imperialism had come to dominate the public mind. With its offer of new markets of a diminishing trade, new lands of British settlement, it is new nationalistic halfpenny press and its imperialist literati and intelligentsia. The imperialism of the businessmen's parliament masked as national interests and destine seemed to fulfill the wildest fancies. No doubt, in 1891, the population of Great Britain barely exceeded 38 million, but there were nearly 2 million British subjects in Cape Colony and Natal, over 600,000 in New Zealand, and over 3 million in Australia, and 5 million in Canada. Add to these figures this is people from Indian subjects of Great Britain, almost 300,000, and a further 46 million in the remaining territories under some form of British rule or influence, and the total amount of 394,600,000. What other states could hope to rival such a figure? The area of the empire was also on the increase. In September 1896, a statesman calculated that in 12 years, 2.6 million square miles had been added to it. That is to say, 24 times the area of Great Britain. In 1895, it was 11,335,000 square miles. A few more annexations, and it would amount to a quarter of the entire land surface of the globe. This was the subject which the convinced imperialists deliberately pursued. For another 2 generations, the lives of the Caribbean masses and those of other colonial subjects would be directly affected by the representative of a ruling class bathed by its own manufactured glory, and whose monumental conceit hid from it the source and scale of the horrors with which it would be associated, as if to satisfy Marx's contempt and add to Engels' class humiliation. The English bourgeoisie and its European confederates sank into the historical swamp of pretentious imperialism and counter-preening nationalism, from which the carnivore of global warfare disgorged. Reckless provocations, diplomatic initiations, followed by its military genius, the intoxication with the empire, exorbitantly led by the ruling class of Europe, to that destruction of their means of production and their labor forces that they signify with the name World War. In Trinidad, during the 7+ decades between the formal abolition of slavery in the British possession and the slaughtering of a generation in the early 20th century, the massive withdrawal of labor from the plantations by the Africans and Creoles had led to some dramatic counter moves on the part of the sugar estates, companies, and the planters, with the moral presentation of the abolitionists still resonating in public discourse. The former owner of black labor resorted to pseudo-Calvinist rhetoric to implicit support from Parliament from their next exercise in the exploitation of labor. Their leading spokesman, William Burnley, lamented the paucity of the laboring population, which prevents competition among them, and they were enabled to make more money than is good and advantageous. For them, which I consider to be the great cause why, instead of advancing in moral improvement, they are rather retrograding at the present period. For I hold that it is impossible for any moral improvement to take place in a community where the want of a good character and a good reputation interpose no serious obstacle to a man's gain in lucrative employment. New immigrants, they all agree, would be necessary. The competition of immigrant labor would discipline Trinidad's black workers to reasonable wages and regular hours of labor. This would in turn make it possible for British sugar producers to undermine the slave sugar of their foreign competitors in the European market. Quote, free trade, after all, meant the free movement of men, as well as of goods. There are three possible sources of immigrant labor that were immediately at hand. On the other islands of the Caribbean, free black people of the United States and the African liberated by the Royal Navy from illegal slave ships along the West African coast. None of these sources, however, proved sufficient. Although the estimate 10,278 West, I think it's from India, immigrated to Trinidad between 1839 and 1849. In the same period, another 7,582 went to British Guiana. And between 1841 and 1861, 3,581 liberated Africans from Sierra Leone and St. Helena arrived, and an even smaller number of free black people made their way from Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. The lure of Trinidad's sugar field was short-lived. The sources of immigration too irregular, somewhat tardily indeed, followed the leads of Parliament and East India Company, and the planters of British Guiana and Trinidadian ruling class and its metropole partners turned their attention to India. For the next 70 years, from 1845 to 1917, indigenous indentured labor became the basis for the sugar plantation in West Trinidad. That's people from India, sorry. Indians, both indentured and free, had become the backbone of Trinidad plantation labor force by about 1860. About 143,000 Indians from India came to Trinidad up to 1917. Immigration began in 1845, where there was a break in 1841-51. Then from 1851 right down to 1917, Indians arrived steadily each year between 1845, 1892, 93, and for some reason, it says a number. In 1892, 39,569 laborers came. They probably displaced a lot of indigenous people out there and black people, channeled through two main Indian ports, Calcutta in the north and Madras in the south. Great majority, however, came from Calcutta, and after 1872, there were no more arrivals from Madras. They were, for the most part, peasants from the northeast of India. The United Providence, now uttered Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar, and the amount to a mere fraction of the hundreds of thousands of Indians who abandoned the region in the 19th century, last decade, to find their ways to the Caribbean, to the West Indies. Oh, that's Caribbean. Fiji, Natal, and Nepal. This area, the seat of ancient cultures, was overpopulated and economically depressed in the later part of the 19th century. The extreme heat in the summer, the floods in the monsoon, leading to whole-scale destruction of crops, and the recurrent famines made life difficult under the British rule. Rural indebtedness was appalling, and agriculture was, quote, by no means an easy business by which to make a living. Moreover, the mutiny cum revolt of 1857 had a disastrous socio-economic effect on this region. Propelled by these circumstances into the far extremities of the British colonial system, they brought with them their culture, their languages, their caste, their music, and their religion. And up to the First World War, it came to be accepted that they survived in Trinidad as a substantial counterposed against troubles with black people and vice versa. I can't say the word because I think it goes against people from India. Labor too, be sure, had provided monetary succors for sugar production, and Trinidad's economy diversified by cocoa production, and in the last decades of the 19th century, oil and asphalt industries rode above the depression that visited the other Caribbean islands. Monoculture in the last quarter of that century. But a deeper social process was occurring, one beneath the apparent apathy between, they use a word that I can't use, and Creoles, Coolie, where they were thrown together, and the existential vice of labor was drawing East and West Caribbean indigenous people into a certain cultural proximation. In 1865, a fierce riot over precedence broke out between the Indians of Woodford Lodge and Endeavor Estates of Cheganas. Creoles and Chinese went to the help of their workmates. Loyalties to the estates transcended those of race in the fighting. Rowdy elements among the Creoles were joined in the HOSIEN celebration in the 1850s. For them, it was like Donnybrook Fair, where people went in the hope of a fight. But also, black people began to take a more respectable part in the percussions as drummers, for which they were paid in rum and cash. And as in Mauritius in the 1850s, the taziyas were sometimes borne by black people. The significance of these events should have been clear, but the whites were deceived by their discourse of domination. That error was a strategic proportion in the society that by the opening decades of the next century was 4% white, 15% biracial, 1% Chinese, and 80% of African and East indigenous origins and descent. The dead season of collective resistance in Trinidad, the time up to the earliest years of the 20th century, was both real and partially imagined, because, quote, the Creole population had nearly all withdrawn from the estates. It was certainly not until they were drawn as workers up to the docks, the railways, the public works, and to the oil fields and asphalt works that they would obtain an effective cause of objective circumstances to openly challenge the crown and the white minority. Meanwhile, they claimed their liberation in other ways. Black laborers in Trinidad during this period reacted to the oppressive society they lived in by attempting to reduce their independence on the plantation by seeking to create an area of freedom for themselves, however limited. They tried to become peasants or artisans. If they failed, they drifted to the towns. In the towns, constant urban unrest reflected an awareness of oppression. The bands fought each other because they were unable to attack the real sources of their misery or powerlessness, but because they were unaware of them. Thus, the ideological and fantic ingredients of the radical tradition of the slaves were preserved by the African Creoles, who were who were augmented by the liberated Africans and their culture. Their language and patois, P-A-T-O-I-S, quote, not understanding by most policemen, magistrates, and officials. Their profound festivals, such as Canbolie and Jamet Carnival, were thinly veiled disregard for angelic and Catholic moralities abound. In their synergistic disregard for religious sects and noisy wakes in their music and dance. These invoked hostilities and disgust among the angelicized people of color classes, shocked the upper class whites, and inspired discomfort in official Trinidad. In 1868, Opea was outlawed. In 1883, drum dances, Kalindia, Bellaria, Bongo were prohibited as immoral. In 1884 and 1895, the festival of aspects of them banned stick fighting and wearing of masks were suppressed. In time to it was believed and expected public primary education would eradicate Creole. But the verse of Calypso suggested the spirit of liberation. The sense of dignity was extinguishable. There one found a quite but sealed expression of outrage. Can't beat my drum in my native land. Can't have we carnival in my native land. Can't have we back channel in my native land. In my own native land. In my own native land. Poem Pasca Dancer, Common Moen Vale. Sorry, that's a different language. That was a poem, everybody. Indian indentured workers who had now assumed the economic role of the slaves, and in the eyes of many white and Creole, their status as well, were understandably somewhat distant from collective resistance. Within 20 years of the arrival of the first 225 Indians on the fatal Razak in 1845, according to Donald Wood, their semi-aggregated communities of villages had quite successfully begun to replication of much of the social stratum of the subcontinent. Vast chasms had been opened between the prosperous who had obtained land, shops, and managed to become moneylenders, and the sea masses. Within 20 years, in several hundred villages woven around sugar and their own industries of wet rice, maize, and peas, and blanket of their transferred society, muffled their response to being cheated, abused, extorted, and exploited by white and countrymen alike. Periodically, there were labor strikes on the estates. A series of them occurred in the 1880s. But the initial expression of Indian consciousness was liberal rather than resistant. Chinese workers were importations absorbently curtailed to less than 2,500 in total, racially melted into one or other of the black population, or required their independence through crafts, the cultivation of marketing of garden vegetables, or further migration. For the whites, particularly the more numerous and culturally dominant French Creoles, the crown is its governor, its colonial administration, and its legislative councils were an annoyance. Elective representation would have been preferable, but the provisions of an abundant supply of cheap labor and Indian migration had largely calmed their concerns about crown colony system. Still the birds of passage that is the colonial official, and their families were extended status among the upper classes in differences to their position. For the most part, neither their culture in the national sense and in its own amount, nor their education or descent qualified them for acceptance otherwise. Thank you for not approving me and letting me know. The governing powers was, of course, Northern European, and the superstructure of government, law, and education derived from Britain. But there was an important elite group which cherished the ideas and values which were Latin and French rather than Anglo-Saxon. White Creoles of French and Spanish descent outnumbered the English Creoles, the British residents, and they're almost certainly more influential to setting the tone of society. And not until the aristocratic French Creoles were thoroughly anglicized and substantially displaced by British capital and British upper class families in the late 19th century was there any possibility of a wholehearted reception in that quarter. The British faction, primarily English and Scottish, which during the decline of French Creole sugar fortunes in the mid-century had for a time sought a forcibly anglicized and subordinate the foreign Creoles, had been subdued since Governor Gordon regime in the late 1860s. They were content to leave the settlements in of the white hierarchies of the time. But despite their differences, the white elites held the line on two matters. The first involved representative of government. The elite would rise this issue on those occasions when their more aggressive ambitions were thwarted by the Crown's executive or by the British Parliament. The Water Rights of 1903 and the trouble stimulus to the simultaneous to the First World War were just such occasions. The second was people of color and black middle classes, a presence increasingly difficult to ignore. They represented a greater threat to continue white control of society than the black people and Indian masses. Even though their numbers were relatively few, they held the key to the political and social future of Trinidad, and so far seeing Trinidadians realize it. Only the people of color and black middle classes, whose development had been in a sense interrupted only to build up to the crescendo in the last quarter of the 19th century, were as a class unassuaged by Trinidad's prosperity and uncomfortable in the island's catacomb of class and racial relations. The people of color and black middle class consisted of two distinct groups. There was a small group of families, a mixed African and European descent, who were the descendants of the French free people of color, settled in Trinidad since the 1780s. Secondly, there were the people, both black and people of color, who can be described as self-made. They were the descendants of the Trinidad ex-slaves, or the liberated Africans, immigrants, or of immigrants from the Eastern Caribbean. They had acquired their middle class status mainly through their command of British culture and their white collar jobs. The second of the people of color classes have come into being while Trinidad was under British colonial order, was never allowed to obtain the prominence of the Romans, Philips, Agernons, the Montrichards, the Morasses, and the Bourbons of the first, and that's me not being able to pronounce, which PGL Bordy and French Creole historians had described as having, quote, formed a second society parallel to the first and no less distinguished than it. The British Trinidad and the people of color and black middle classes had fallen from their previous heights, ceasing to be able to claim a share in the island's upper classes. Probably a majority of educated black people and people of color men in this period were civil servants. Their commerce virtually closed to them. Teaching the professions and the service offered the only valuable alternative, except for the relatively small number of people of color planters. So they just put black people and people of color just back into the servitude position. Only the small minority could hope to obtain the university education essential for law or medicine. This helped employment in the service, including teaching in the government schools, as the only source of acceptable white-collar jobs. The distribution of privilege and advantages of the radical determinant society frustrated their large vision. The achievement of equality with white oligarchy and acquisition of power, like their counterparts among black petite bourgeoisie elsewhere, they resented the aberration to which the belief of black inferiority assigned them. A correspondent of the Telegraph wrote that no amount of wealth or education enabled a man in Trinidad to enjoy such prestige. If he lacked the correct thing, planters of the wealth merit the character were tabooed, being without the colonial passport. More potent than education habits, principles, behaviors, wealth, talent, or even genius itself. People outside the Caribbean had no idea of the actual position of the educated man, of the incorrect thing. It was especially galling when men of color of good family were subjected to discrimination. So, though it had not been necessary to respond to Anthony Thorpe, when 1859 he published his anti-black tome, The Caribbean and the Spanish Main, by 1888, when Freud's English, the English in the West, in the Caribbeans, where they used the West something, appeared to challenge from the newer elements of the middle class as imperative. Increasingly enough, it came from a black and not a person of color representative. It was fundamentally radical Jacob Thomas, in his Freudosity. They use West, but I'll say Caribbean, West Indian, fables explained, set before his readers a broader canvas than the childish insults of black people, quote unquote, with which Freud had been intellectually satisfied. The intra-African black person is clearly powerless to struggle successfully against personal enslavement, annexation, or volunteer, or fight for protection of his territory. What he asks will in the coming ages be the opinion and attitude of the extra African 10 millions of the Western Hemisphere, dispersed so widely over the surface of the globe, apt apprentices in every conceivable department to civilized culture. Will these men remain forever too poor, too isolated from one another, or grand racial combinations, or will the naturally opulent cradle of their people too long a place of violence and unholy greed, becoming at length and scared watchwords of a generation willing to be and able to conquer or perish under its inspiration. Thomas, whose parents had been slaves only a few years before his birth, who had himself grown up and taught in the pathetically inadequate little country schools that had been distributed by the government among the rural black masses, and whose command of the patois had resulted in his writing Creole grammar, in 1869 spoke not for the middle class. He rejected their ambition and the master from which it was copied. The middle classes, however, could not reject him. He was the most important black intellectual in Trinidad during his lifetime. His, quote, efforts were important to the person of color and black middle class, for they seemed to show that this group was more cultured than the dominant whites, who were dismissed as being crassly materialistic. Thomas' literary activities indicated that non-whites were the cultural leaders, and though the majority of the people of color and black middle classes were pained in lever their lives, their families, and their reputation away from association with the black masses, and a few black men of letters like Samuel Carter, Joseph Lewis, the editor of the New Era, William Herbert, editor of Trinidad Press and the Trinidad Colonist, H.A. Nurse, George Padmore's father, the barrister Henry Sylvester Williams, achieved respectively closer approximation to Thomas's comprehension. Williams, of course, the primary initiator of the Pan-African Conference that convened in London in July 1900, came closest. He chose to realize Thomas' ideal. He and Thomas, along with other explicitly political figures of the person of color and black middle class, Henry, Alcazar, Edgar Morrissey Smith, and C. Prudhomme David, active in the official affairs of Trinidad, intentionally began to radicalization of the island's public discourse. It was, however, a second thrust of the middle classes that set the tone and lent that discourse a particular character. The society arranged by these generations of people of color and black middle classes of Trinidad was a chiaroscuro of the white upper middle classes. Its priorities had little to do with the elements of the radical tradition sounded by Thomas Fraudacity. In their society, the shadings of privilege and status, acceptability and tolerance, the plain etiquette of brown upon black, were all subtle on a social art as could be devised, with the cultural, historical, political, educational, familial, and financial materials in their hands. One almost had to be a Trinidadian, one with a special intuition at that, to know what was required and expected, what indeed were the possibilities for any of their young launching into the orbit of adult intercourse, while the white elites seemed to possess the convince of bold denominational distinctions. The more easily measured amassed acreage of fortune and the property of names that could be located in the historical traditions, frankly elaborated in Trinidadian literature and journalism. The standard deviations among the people of color and black middle classes were many times as such tiny gradations that an instinctive social subtlety was a sine qua non. Gross disparities, to be sure, existed, but they occurred too infrequently for custom or habit to be unerring guides. In any case, the highly esteemed place of the light complexioned elites was easily enough achieved over the generations or two, though its value was not appreciably lessened by mixed marriages. Simple color was considered a crude and rude measure at best. Any black aspirant sufficiently talented, ambiguous, or sponsored by professional training or family affluence could ensure his or her grandchild, who be phenotypically eligible for a pinnacle of ultra class recognition. There was, though, the ceiling beyond which black people could not rise. Anticipating the closure, many of black people, particularly the intelligentsia, sought to substitute education and literature as currency in the inter-class exchange. Where Thomas had succeeded, others naturally strove, hoping to draw the legitimizing attention of white and people of color alike, and thereby rolling aside the stone of caste for themselves and hopefully for their children. The highest coin, as was the case among the Victorian English intelligentsia itself, was literature. It was the rank of the educated black person. Probably because education was so important in their rise in status, the members of this group attached great weight to the culture and intellectual life. They boosted, I gotta do a puzzle. Where was I at? They boosted their command of British culture, their ability to speak and write good English, their interest in things of the mind. It was literacy, familiarity with books, the possession of, quote, culture, which mattered, as well as an occupation which involved no manual labor. These things were more essential criteria for membership of the middle class than wealth or lightness of skin. In one sense, they formed an intelligentsia in that they took pride in being the most cultured sectors of the community, although they were not part of the ruling class. They attached so much importance to culture because they had no other valuable and valued possession to hold on to. It was not surprising, therefore, that members of people of color and black middle class often took the lead in literary and intellectual activities. In journalism and literary criticism, they grew to be supreme, outdistancing the whites in their celebration and message of the most advanced social ideas, literary forms, and preoccupations available to the English-speaking public. Thus, when it was their turn to articulate a challenge of colonialism and racial domination, their superior education and intellect were both their rationale and their tool. They were indeed the basis for the nationalism that C.L.R. James exhibited in his first political work, The Case of Caribbean and Self-Government. It's not nationalism. Self-government is not about nationalism. But we'll find out. On his arrival of the Caribbeans, the colonial official experiences a shock. Here, as a thoroughly civilized community, wearing the same clothes that he does, speaking no other language but his own, with its best men as good as, and only too often better than himself. What is the effect on the colonial Englishman when he recognizes, as he has to recognize, the quality of those over whom he is placed in authority? Men have justified themselves, and he falls heavily back on the ability of the Anglo-Saxon to govern. The trusteeship of the mother country until such time, always in the distant future, as these colonies had stand by themselves, etc., etc. For the communities such as ours, although there is race prejudice, there is no race antagonism. Where the people have reached their present level in wealth, education, general culture, and crown colony system of government had no place. It was useful in its days, but that day is now over. It is a fraud because it is based on assumptions of superiority which have no foundations in fact. Admirable as are their gifts in the direction, yet administrative capacity is not the monopoly of the English. And even if it were, charity begins at home, especially in these difficult times. Black Victorian becomes a black Jacobin. Okay, here we go. Cyril Leon Robert James was born in Trinidad, 1901. The son of a black Trinidadian school teacher, grandson just over a half a century after the abolition of slavery, of a sugar estate pan boiler, and an engine driver. His earliest years were in Tanapuna, a village of 3,000 by his account, situated halfway between the capital of Portsea, Spain, to the west and Armenia to the east. It had been long along the road between Port Spain and Armenia that the ex-slaves had found many of their new villages in the 1840s. In the valley around Tunapuna, liberated quote-unquote Africans had settled, planting their gardens in the hillside. And 30 years later, in the 1870s, it was one of the sites where the dancing and fighting bands, with their territorial and semi-secret codes of proliferated. Tunapuna had, quote, boasted gangs called Sweet Evening Bells, Taipans, Greyhounds, Island Builders. As a child in a slightly more respectable Tunapuna, James recalled that he had quite early beginning to absorb much of the survival ethics that had attached itself to the black middle class of which he was a part. It was about 6 years of age when I got hold of my mother's copy of Shakespeare. There were 37 plays in it, or 36. And there was an illustration in the front of each play. The illustration had below it the act and the scene, which it illustrated, and I remember the illustrations from Julius Caesar, saying, quote, "How ill this tapper burns," end quote. Now I could not read a play of Shakespeare, but I remember perfectly looking up the acts and scenes stated in the foot of the illustration and reading that particular scene. I am quite sure that before I was 7, I had read all those scenes. Notwithstanding the availability of adventure stories in his mother's library, the child's reading was hardly what Richard Smalls describes as a normal youth interest. James was being trained and was exhibiting the lessons of his class. In that prescribed inventory, there was contained also the Puritan importance of class property. Yeah. I was fascinated by the calypso singers and the sometimes ribald ditties they sang in their tents during the carnival time. But like many of the black middle class, to my mother, a calypso was a matter of the N-word, wells, into wells, and at best, the common people. I was made to understand that the road to Calypso tent was the road to hell, and there were always plenty of examples of hells inhabitants to whom she could point. The sexual and moral customs of black lower classes, for all their vitality and attractiveness, amounted to the rejection of English bourgeois sensibility. They were an affront to a morality of the colonial model set before the natives. Unquestionably, in a black family that knew the rules, this implicitly political statement had no place in the future of a properly instructed young black man. Quote, good society, white, black, people of color conspired against what it's interpreted as Doyan Sun, satanic humor. Cricket, however, was lionized in the culture of James' class. Indeed, from all indication, its presence pervaded every strata of Trinidadian society. Richard Small reported. The membership of the various clubs were determined by occupation and social class, and at that time, even more sharply than now, that discrimination would be virtually the same as differentiation according to color. Queen's Park Club, the controllers of cricket in the island, were white and wealthy. Shamrock, Catholic French Creole traders and cocoa planters. Maple, middle class of brown skin. Shannon, the black middle class version, with white collar office types and teachers. And then Stingo, the tradesmen, artisan workers. Add to that almost everybody played or took an interest in cricket, and that it was played for up to 8 months of the year, and some estimate of its potential for social and sublimated social expression will be grasped. Cricket was James' father's game, his uncle Kefis and his aunt Judith's game, his cousin Kojo's game, at interest even to be found in his grandfather, the extraordinary Rush Roder. It was a game of the English schoolboy. Recreation meant cricket, for in those days, except for infrequent athletic sports meetings, cricket was the only game. Our house was superbly situated, exactly behind the wicket. For James, when it was a neutral obsession, one to which he would turn as he sought to make his way in the adult world, and one to which he would return when he sought to make comprehensible his life and the colonial world in which he was raised. The Trinidad of James' young life was already showing signs of popular agitation. In 1897, following the models of the English Working Men's Association of the 1830s and the Leeds Working Men's Parliamentary Reform Association organized in 1861, the Trinidad Workmen's Association was founded with a membership of 50 skilled and unskilled workers, which include black carpenters, masons, tailors, and at least one pharmacist and one chemist. It was according to Brensley Samario, the first such organization in the British Caribbean. The Trinidad body emerged as one concerned with both trade union and political pressure group function. It was founded just before the visit of the 1897 Royal Commission, sent to the British Caribbean to examine the seriousness of the sugar depression and to recommend measures for bringing relief to the colonies. The association's first president, Walter Mills, a pharmacist, gave evidence before the commission. Mills complained against the unsanitary conditions of the colonial towns, dwellings, and estates, pressed for the reduction of taxes, especially on foodstuffs and agricultural implements used by the laboring people, better transport facilities, a setting up of minor industries, the introduction of saving banks, and the further opening of crown lands. In addition, the association was strongly opposed to state-aided indigenous Indian immigrants. These are people from India, which Mills claimed increased the competition for the starvation wages paid on sugar estates. Above all, Mills said the colony should be granted elective government. The association soon lapsed, only to be reactivated, affiliating itself in 1906 with the new British Labour Party. Now with hundreds of members, it's beginning to function as a representative of the working class, campaigning for labor reform and agitating for short working hours, sick leave and against the color bar, quote unquote, expanded its membership by attracting the traditionally political indigenous East Indian worker from India. The colonial government was unsurprisingly hostile, advising the colonial office of association dubious character. Its members, some of whom are of but doubtful reputation, are for the most part not working men, and have no stake in the colony. They have adopted their title simply with the object of securing recognition by the English Labour Party, and thus obtaining for ourselves an importance that they would not otherwise possess. But Europe and the colonial government of the British and French empires were soon caught up in the First World War. It would prove to be a historical force from which empires would never recover. Who's all in here still? No, not many people in here still, huh? No. The war itself, over and above the toil it exacted in Europe, but not entirely European, was a fundamental contradiction to the raison d'etre of British Empire. The assumption was that, quote, the defense of the self-governing colonies from internal attack and the maintenance of sea power were British responsibilities. During the war, India, alone with 1.5 million men and women in British uniforms of one sort or another, supplied more troops than all of the other dominions and colonies. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa were dominions together. And what India had done for Britain, Africa did for France. Over 545,000 African native soldiers, wrote George Patmore, were employed by France, chiefly as shock troops, and stemming the tide of the German advance during the most critical periods of the war. They're used as cannon fodder. Tens of thousands of Africans also served in Germany, Belgium, and British forces in the East Africa. While from the United States of the 342,277 black troops who served, 200,000 fought with the French army uniformed as French soldiers. From the Caribbeans, troops were also mobilized, most of them, some 20,000, serving in the British Caribbean Regiment. However, there had been problems, for some certain considerations overrode loyalty to Britain. In Trinidad, the press used the term better class, quote unquote, to describe the white and the lighter complexioned biracial peoples who constituted the merchant and planter class. In Barbados, the term used was, quote, the best class, end quote. When enlistment of recruits started in 1915, the better class, quote unquote, young men throughout the British Caribbean refused to join except as officers in the same contingents as the black soldiers. Arthur and Drew Caperian, a Corsican Creole who was leading the campaign for recruits, complained that, quote, our best class young men are shrinking, end quote, from joining the public contingents, quote, because of the lamentable question of color which lies at the bottom of everything in these parts, end quote. Some, quote, better class, end quote, soldiers came to London and joined British regiments. The majority joined with, quote, the better class soldiers in the other colonies to form the merchants and planters contingent. But the advent of the Great War was brought to the fore, a more considerable and mean enemy of colonial interest. No, not everyone had prepared to make sacrifices for the general good. The colonial merchants saw the start of the war in Europe as a signal for an immediate increase in prices. On the very day of the government's announcement that the war had started in Europe, the port of Spain, Gazette, reported that prices had risen steeply. This inflation of prices broke the backs of the black working class, and in the island's cash economy, and was the primary cause of the strikes that followed. Oil workers struck in 1917, rail workers, scavengers, stevedores, sweepers, sugar, and dock workers in 1919, asphalt and railway workers, again in 1920, and the Trinidad workmen's Association joined after the war by returning ex-soldiers enraged over the racial discrimination they had experienced in military service, was at the center of agitation. This was the basis of the social force that Captain Comprinia, returning from the same war, would lead into the Trinidad Labour Party in 1932. Contact with Europe during the First World War gave the Caribbean radicals a first-hand opportunity to learn from Europe, and so the post-war period was increasingly socialist. In the way that Caribbean indigenous understood the term. Comprinia wore a red button on his lapel, and many of his followers wore red shirts in imitation of the Reds of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. In these years, Trinidad had become a part of the post-war black movement that within 20 or so years would pull all the empires apart. Just as the 1914-18 war saw the Indian nationalists make great strides, so there were important stirrings elsewhere. In 1915, riots in central Ceylon led the alarmist governor to proclaim martial law and to imprison many notable Sinhalese, Sinhalese. They included Don Stephan, Senawaki, later the first prime minister, who never quite forgave the British. In 1918, the Ceylon National Congress was formed following the Indian precedent. In the same years as the Ceylon's riots, an abortive rising of Nyasaland, led by the Reverend John Chilambui, demonstrated the growing passion of African nationalism. In West Africa, the Indian nationalists had eager admirers. When India was invited to the war cabinet in 1970, they cried, quote, "Why not West Africa as well?" As India and the Dominions were invited to the peace conference in 1919, Dr. Naka Bruce of the West Coast, of the Gold Coast, sent resolutions to the Western powers so that, quote, the voice of West Africa could be also heard in Versailles. And First Pan-African Congress met in Paris in 1919. At the same time, in Kenya, the Kayua began to organize political associations. Lives were lost in Nairobi riots in 1922. Similarly, a few political movements were grown in the Caribbean, such as the Representative of Government Association, the Grenada, founded in 1914, and Captain Coprinia's, I can't say his name right, Trinidad Workingmen's Association, which flourished at the end of the war. Marcus Garvey of Jamaica founded the Black Nationalist Universal Black Improvement Association, they used the N-word, which had brief international fame at the end of the war. James, however, though he was aware of these events, kept his distance. In politics, I took little interest. He finished school in 1918 and was content to tend his two passions, his two disciplines, cricket and literature. I had a circle of friends, most of them white, with whom I exchanged ideas, books, records, and manuscripts. We published local magazines and gave lectures or wrote articles of Woodworth, the English drama, and poetry as a criticism of life. We lived according to the tenets of Matthew Arnold, spreading sweetness and light, and the best that has been thought and said in the world, never losing sight of my plan to go abroad and write. I studied and practiced obstinately the art of fiction. He had to be sure, made choices, political choices, that which he would find it increasingly difficult to live, as the forces of the world bore down on him, as a black radical tradition acquired its revolutionary form. Still, his earliest direction was in contrast to the Malcolm Nurse, his childhood playmate. Nurse matriculated at the Roman Catholic School of Immaculate Conception and the private, Pamphilian High School. Also graduated in 1918. For a few years, he, as did James, would work as a reporter for the Weekly Guardian. In 1925, he would immigrate to the United States. Within 2 years of his arrival, he would join the American Communist Party. It was then that Nurse would become George Padmore. But even before leaving Trinidad, he had developed an open antagonism to imperialism. The Guardian had provided him with that object. The job bored him, where there was no scope for thoughtful writing, and he detested his editor, Edward J. Patridge, an Englishman who demanded subservience from his black staff. When Patridge died, Nurse wrote that he had been, quote, one of the most arrogant agents of British imperialism I have ever encountered. He held him in utter contempt, and he had hoped to use my pen in exposing his role before the colonial workers and peasants whom he oppressed through his dirty sheet, The Guardian. James and Padmore would meet in London in 1932. By then, James would have just become a Trotskyist. He moved away from that. The book I'm reading, he moved away from Trotskyism. Right? Just want everybody to know that. He moved away from Trotskyism. But Padmore was barely a year from the end of his work with the communist movement. Their political collaboration would begin in 1935. Still, while in Trinidad, James had taught in school, played cricket for Maple, and worked as a part-time reporter. As a black journalist on the island in the early 1920s, he witnessed the maturing of nationalist politics under Caprinian Richard Small. However, suggested that, quote, it was not until 1924 that James started paying anything like close attention to Caprini's speeches, and not until 1931 that he became a follower of Saprinia. It was his conversation in 1932 with Lier Constantine, the cricketer, that had unnerved him and perhaps begun the process. I was holding forth about some examples of low West Caribbean cricket morals when Constantine gave with an almost aggressive expression on his face. You have it all wrong, you know, he said coldly. What did I have all wrong? You have it all wrong. You believe all that you read in those books. They are no better than we. I floundered around, and I hadn't intended to say that they were better than we. Yet a great deal of what I had been saying was just that. Constantine reverted to an old theme. I have told you that we won that match. We won it? The conversation broke up, leaving me somewhat bewildered. They were no better than we. I knew we were man of man was good as anybody. I had known that since my school days. But if that were the truth, it was not the whole truth. James' politics, like those of Caprinia, however, remained within the parameters of parliamentarianism. He would need Marxism, he maintained later, to break with that assumption. By the late 1920s, he was a nationalist. But though he had read Garvey, Black World, had interviewed Garvey himself, then the later visited Trinidad after the expulsion from the United States, and was also familiar with some of Du Bois' early works. James' vision had still only partially progressed beyond the ideological tradition in which he had been reared. I hadn't really a faintest idea about black politics then, nor was there any talk about African or black revolt. His commitment was to fiction writing, an intent that had borne some fruit in the publication of some of his short stories and the development of the manuscript for what would become Miti Ali. Nevertheless, his political apprenticeship had begun and he was preparing to write a biography of Caprinian. I began to study the history of the island. I collected Hansard, old white papers, reports of royal commissions. There were plenty around, which nobody wanted. It was all very simple. And straight Labour Party. For foreground were there were the black masses, the brown professionals, the clerical middle classes, the Europeans and local whites, Stingo and Shannon, Maple and Queen Parks. My hitherto vague ideas of freedom crystallized around the political convictions. We should be free to govern ourselves. All right, here we go. Okay. It was then that Constantine, the more disruptive political force of James's social milieu, intervened. Constantine wanted to write a book, one which, from his experience of playing cricket in England since 1929, might express his insights into the game and English society. He invited James to England and collaborated with him on the project. In March of 1932, James left for England. He wouldn't return to Trinidad for 26 years. All right, I'm going to see how far we got until the next thing. Remember 374. 374. Okay, we can go further. 374. Okay. British socialism, which Britain has never been socialist. Never has been socialist. The socialist traditions in the British metropole, to which Anglophone black people and African and the Caribbean were exposed decidedly from those of their Francophone and American counterparts. For one, the history of the development of socialist movements and socialist thought in Britain had been marked by unique historical events: the formation of the first significant industrial working class, the defeat of the revolutionary and then the parliamentary reform, charter movement in the early 19th century, British domination of the international capital and trade during the most of the century, the ambiguous presence of Marx and Engels in Britain from the mid-19th century until their deaths in 1883 and 1895, respectively, the founding of the First International in 1864, and the appearance of a new British Empire, the concomitant intensification of Anglo-Saxonism as a national ideology. One of the historical consequences of these several events was a precedence into the 20th century of the working class movements with strong trade unionist sympathies. In 1895, the total membership of the unions of the United Kingdom, including those which were not represented at the Congress of British Trade Unions that year, as estimated at 1.5 million, that is, say, about a fifth of the entire number of adults, male workers, where there was nothing like it in any other great nation. Moreover, the estimate of the strength of the working class, not confined to a general view of the country as a whole, but distinguished between the different districts and branches of national industry, yielded even more striking results. In Lancashire, Durham, and Northumberland, the trade unions contained at least a tenth of the entire population and half the adult male workers. It would be true to say that the Lancashire cotton spinner or weaver, the miner of Durham and Northumberland, membership of the trade unions was in practice compulsory. Indeed, the size of this army of working men was perhaps the best security in the unions would pursue a prudent policy. In highly civilized country where there were not a million or a million and a half revolutionaries. And of the British unions, about the year of 1895, the most conservative and cautious were precisely those whose membership included the large proportion of men employed in trade. This impulse was joined by the formation of specially political and electoral arms of the socialist movement, the Independent Labour Party, founded in 1893, and the Labour Party of circa 1900s. Together, the trade unions and the parliamentary parties had decisive effect on working militancy. While there is evidence to suggest a degree of working class mistrust of the state in its very everyday forms, the British labor movement had tended to assert both its industrial and political activities within the existing national political structure. The Gramscian term, it lacked a sufficiently hegemonic perspective to change the central institutions of state power. Finally, the English nationalism or Anglo-Saxonism, so powerful an ideological phenomenon during the last quarter of the 19th century, to some extent insulted British socialists from a ready accepted or submission to socialist currents originating from the continent. The political and ideological impact of organizations like the Marxian Henry Heidmann's Social Democratic Federation, 1883, which exhibited its founders' hostility to trade unionism. William Morris Patrician, Socialist League, 1885, and the Socialist Labor Party, c. 1900, inspired by the visionary American intellectual Daniel Delon, were of only indirect significance. Prior to 1917, there were only two Marxist organizations of any consequence. These were the British Socialist Party, the BCP, and the British Labour Party, SLP. The BSP, which I will have no idea anything about these guys, was the direct descendant of the Social Democratic Federation, SPF, founded in 1883 under the leadership of Heidmann, having been formed in 1911 as a coalition of the SDF. Make sure, yeah. Sections of the non-Marxist ILP, the clarion movement of various local socialist societies. The members of the SDF during the 19th century never succeeded 4,000. The BSP, initial nominal membership of 40,000, declined to more than a third that number by the outbreak of war, and active membership was considerably less. The SLP had split away from the SDF at the turn of the century. It was purer in doctrine and correspondingly much smaller. The membership never exceeded 1,000. The majority concentrated in Scotland. More well known and affluent as was the Fabian Society, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, Annie Besant, Graham Wellas, Sidney Oliver, G.D.H. Cole, and Margaret Cole, whose tendencies were broad enough to encompass imperialism, state socialism, and anarchy. Their mark would be more enduring in British thought, not the least for their establishment of the London School of Economics, but it was labor socialism, the anti-Marxist reformist, ethical, and pragmatic resolution of class war, that direction of policy of the British trade unions and the Labour Party, and to which British workers mostly attended. By their very nature, the rank and file, the men and women who brought and sold literature rather than wrote it, and listened to speeches rather than give them, produced very little material of their own. We need to know more of these anonymous men and women who swelled the ranks of the trade councils, contingency parties, constituency parties, and ILP branches up and down the country. But such testimonies as we do have, supplemented by the local labor press and other historical records, testified of the pervasive influence of labor socialism. Particularly phrases such as, quote, a higher social consciousness, the social organization, the socialist commonwealth. Let us call to the man with the muckrake, ballot box and not bullets, etc., are encountered repeatedly. Even when eventually, after the Russian Revolution and the founding of the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, and uncompromisingly revolutionary Marxist Party appeared, it was still the case that very little success would accrue to Marxism among the working class. As Neil Woods maintains, British communism has to a great extent been shaped by its development in the shadows of what has become the largest and most powerful social democratic party in the world. Much of the history of the CPGB and its differences from the Communist Party elsewhere can perhaps be explained by the gargantuan strength and effectiveness of the Labour Party. And neither the post-war economic decline of the 1920s nor even the depression coming on the heels of the party fiasco and, in general, strike in 1926 would establish the SPGB as a mass party. For the most part, then, following the Depression, English Marxism became a creature more than a son and a daughter of the middle and upper middle classes than the English workers. Massive unemployment in their ranks, the emergence of fascist movements in Europe, a decade of displacement of the corruption and incompetence of the bourgeois democracy, and the spectacular achievements of the Russian Revolution had worked their magic. Changes in the intellectual life of the nation had often been perceived at an earlier date among university students. Prior to the 1930s, British students had never exhibited the political fervor so characteristic on the continent. Consequently, it must have been with some satisfaction that Karl Radek was able to announce to the Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934 that in the heart of the bourgeoisie, England and Oxford, there where the sons of the bourgeoisie receive their final polish. We observe the crystallization of a group which sees salvation only together with the proletariat. The beginning of an unprecedented political ferment took place in 1931 when embryonic communist organizations were established at London and Cambridge University by students returning from Germany. A Marxist society saw the light of day at London School of Economics in 1931, and a radical cosmopolitan society replaced the old international society. Oxford notorious October Club, founded in January 1932, was banned in November of the following years, ostensibly for its criticism of the officers' training corps. Nevertheless, class arrogance, bitter division between workers and the class of intelligentsia, the residue of xenophobia, so central in the earlier century of the role of Irish workers and the British working class movement, and later as a support of imperialism, all worked against the possibility of British communist movements became a dominant force among the country's proletariat. Indeed, counter forces of the CPGB and Bolshevism had already developed in the 1920s among the British workers, with the emergence of the Pleb League, the National Guild League section of the ILP, the Workers' Socialist Federation, WSF, and the South Wales Socialist Society, SWSS. By the 1930s, British Marxism, the intellectual and moral residue of British communism, had achieved its most enduring influences among the university intellectuals And British socialism had been transformed into electoral phenomenon with the Labour Party and the ILP as its most significant manifestation. We'll stop there. It says the Black Radical and in the Metropoles, and that is on page 378. Woo! Yeah, I'm gonna read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction next. I think it's gonna be good. Metropole. All right. Great job. All right, we got someone coming up. All right, they're up. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't got much to say. But yeah, it's been talking a lot about India and how the forces there interacted.
Yeah.
And I do find it interesting that we are learning about that. And I think it often gets I think that when it comes to like India, it often gets overlooked when it comes to like forces of like race and that.
Yeah.
Like it often gets overlooked how much of the system is influenced by the system that India had, and vice versa.
Yeah, they utilized the Indian population in India to displace other indigenous people, so that they're like kind of like the Irish and the indentured servitudes displaced black workers. Well, not too much because they put the black workers into slavery, but you know what I mean. They utilized them in a way to keep the indigenous and black people into a subservient role of basically like free labor, and then they still exploit them by putting in a dominant like race, demographic in order to displace that. You know what I mean? So yeah, they were utilized as indentured servitudes, but there's some places where the people in India really integrated with people of that demographic and still did some revolts and stuff like that. But yeah, they utilized that demographic of people in order to displace and stuff like that, and to bring down the labor and put the indigenous and black people into more of a subservient role of like service industry and shit like that, you know?
Yeah, and I would say that correct me if I'm off, but I would say that has happened with almost all colonized groups.
Yep.
So that there's been like the ones that went to the side of the colonizer to try and like
assimilate,
have to deal with to deal with having to not having to deal with the forces of colonization as much. Yeah.
It just goes to show you that like most of the people that are the top echelons in those colonial countries that dive into neocolonialism still are dominated by the presence of like white people, because most people that like the Western powers at least are mostly like dominated by white faces, you know, in the ruling class sector. You know what I mean? So yeah, you can still see that now too, you know.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else?
I would just say maybe be a little more careful when it comes to seeing the word mixed, because when it comes to because in this book, whenever it says mixed, it's most likely going to be talking about like racial stuff, and when it comes to racial stuff, we know that that's a very insensitive way of dealing with it. I'm saying like be a little more careful, because when it came to the weddings part, you, instead of saying multiracial or biracial, you did end up saying mixed.
I think I said it once and I messed up.
No, yeah, no, I know.
I don't feel attacked. I'm just letting you know.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you. All right, then. Do you have anything else?
No, thank you for letting me up.
Yeah. Do you think I should move on to Black Reconstruction after this book? What do you think?
Well, I haven't read Black Reconstruction myself, so I don't know much about it. If you feel like doing that, then go ahead.
I was thinking about it because this book mentions it, and I would like to see what the boys actually says instead of reading a secondhand account of the boys. So
Yeah, and if you do want to, do you know someone who has already read it?
no, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
It'll be good. It'll be good. We'll experience it together.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Then, sure.
The book I'm reading called with C.L.R. James Notes on Dialectics, Hegelianism, Marxism, Leninism. It talks about this book and how this book misrepresents C.L.R. James's notion and his position in the Black radical tradition. So I'm going to see when that happens and stuff like that, so that way I can figure that out.
And also, just to let you know, that book is not in the Discord.
What, Black Reconstruction?
No, not Black Reconstruction. The C.L.R. James book.
It is now. It is now. Yeah. Lynn put it in there just now. Lynn's been doing a lot of work for me. They got me all the Lennon books that I need from all of his 47 volumes, 45, somewhere around there, and also the philosophical notes of Lennon, and got me a whole bunch of C.L.R. James that I'm also going to read too. You know what I mean? So
Nice.
I'm going to read a lot about dialectics because I think engaging with the dialectics helps you engage with the readings and looking at things through a Marxist dialectical lens. You know what I mean? So yeah. So. Yeah. I think it's important for me. It's helping me, and I think it's going to help my mental health too. So as much as I can learn about dialectics is important to me right now. So all right. Well, I'll go ahead and close it out. Let's have something to say.
Just much love and take care.
All right, everybody. Thank you, Sebastian, and everybody. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.